The morning of December 21st, 1944, brought something more dangerous than the bitter cold that gripped the Belgian countryside. It brought silence, the kind of silence that makes seasoned soldiers check their weapons twice and scan the horizon with nervous eyes. In the ruins of an unprocessing abandoned coal plant near Malmedy, a 19-year-old American private named Francis Sherman Curry crouched behind a blown-out doorway, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the frozen air. His hands, already stiff from the cold, gripped a single-shot bazooka that he'd borrowed just hours earlier. He had no idea if it would even fire. Less than 30 yards away, a narrow stone bridge stretched across a frozen creek. That bridge was about to become the most important piece of real estate in Belgium, because rolling toward it through the morning mist was something that would make any rational soldier turn and run. A full German armored column, Panzer tanks, half-tracks loaded with infantry, and support vehicles stretching back into the forest like a steel serpent ready to strike. If they crossed that bridge, they would punch straight through the American lines and trap hundreds of wounded men behind them. Francis Curry could have run. His orders didn't say anything about staying to fight an entire armored division by himself. But behind him, in the wreckage of the factory, 5 American soldiers lay pinned under collapsed masonry. They couldn't move. They couldn't escape. And they were counting on him whether they knew it or not. So instead of running, Curry did something that any military manual would call suicide. He positioned himself at what he would later describe as a suicidal angle. Too close to fire safely, too exposed to survive, and with absolutely no backup coming. For the next 3 hours, this teenager from upstate New York would single-handedly hold off one of the most dangerous German advances of the entire Battle of the Bulge. But who was Francis Curry? And how did a small-town kid end up making a stand that would change the course of history? Francis Sherman Curry was born on a summer day in 1925 in Hurleyville, a quiet town nestled in the mountains of upstate New York. Life wasn't easy for the Curry family. Francis lost his father when he was just 12 years old, leaving him to be raised by his mother and grandmother. He was the kind of boy who spent his afternoons building tree forts in the woods behind his house, and his evenings trying to fix whatever had broken around the farm that day. He wasn't a natural student, and he certainly wasn't looking for a fight. When he tried to enlist at 17, the army turned him away for being too young. But Francis was persistent. The moment he turned 18, he walked into that same recruitment office and signed his name on the dotted line. The United States Army trained him as a rifleman, and by early 1944, he found himself shipped across the Atlantic with the 30th Infantry Division, known by their nickname, Old Hickory. By December of that year, Curry had already seen more combat than most soldiers see in an entire war. He'd fought his way through France, the Netherlands, and into Germany itself. He'd watched friends die. He'd fired his rifle in anger, in fear, and in desperate hope. But nothing in his training or experience could have prepared him for what was about to unfold in the frozen forests of Belgium. The German counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by more than 1,000 tanks, surged through the Ardennes forest under cover of snow and fog. Their mission was simple but devastating. Split the Allied forces too, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. The American forces stationed in the Ardennes were exhausted, under-equipped, and completely unprepared for a major assault. Most commanders believed the Germans were finished, that the war would be over by Christmas. They were catastrophically wrong. Curry's unit, Company K of the 120th Infantry Regiment, was posted near the town of Malmedy in Belgium. Their orders seemed routine. Hold the line and protect the road network that led deeper into Allied territory. What none of them knew was that just beyond the tree line, elite German Panzer divisions, including battle-hardened SS tank crews, were rolling forward with orders to break through at any cost. In the first hours of the assault, everything went wrong for the Americans. Anti-tank guns were destroyed before they could fire a shot. Communication lines were cut by artillery barrages. Entire units were scattered and forced to fall back in chaos. But Francis Curry didn't fall back. Instead, he found himself with a handful of other soldiers holding a weak defensive position in and around the ruins of that coal processing plant. The structure had been gutted by earlier fighting, its walls blown out, its roof collapsed, but it sat right beside the most critical bridge in the sector. The Germans needed that bridge to continue their advance, and Curry was the only thing standing in their way. As the snow continued to fall that December morning, Francis Curry made a decision that would define not just his own life, but the lives of everyone behind him. He wasn't thinking about medals or glory, or being remembered in history books. He was thinking about 5 wounded men who couldn't run, and a bridge that couldn't be allowed to fall. At 6:28 in the morning, the silence was shattered by a sound that every infantry soldier learned to fear: the low metallic grinding of tank treads on frozen ground. Then came the rhythmic crunch of boots marching in formation, muffled German voices giving orders, and that unmistakable trembling in the earth that only a full armored column could produce. Curry crawled to the edge of his shattered doorway and peered out into the morning mist. What he saw would have sent most men running for the rear lines. A column of German soldiers was advancing down the narrow road toward the bridge. Infantry supported by tanks, with the lead vehicle being a Panzer Mark V, its turret slowly scanning left and right like some mechanical predator hunting for prey. There was no time to think, no time to call for backup, no time to wait for orders. Behind him, those 5 wounded Americans were still trapped under the collapsed wall, unable to move, unable to defend themselves. If that German column crossed the bridge, it would roll right over them and continue its advance into the heart of the American lines. Curry looked at the tactical situation with the cold clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. A frontal assault against an armored column with nothing but a single bazooka was pure suicide. But there was one possible chance, one angle that might work. If he could position himself just before the bottleneck of the bridge, where the lead tank would be forced to slow down and turn, he might be able to hit it in the side armor where it was weakest. It wasn't a defensible position. It offered no cover whatsoever. It was completely exposed to the road with no path of retreat. Any military tactician would have called it a suicidal angle, but it was the only shot he had. Francis Curry chose it anyway. Dragging the heavy bazooka across the icy concrete floor, Curry positioned himself behind a twisted steel beam that had once supported the factory's roof. The metal was cold enough to burn his skin through his torn gloves, but it was the only cover he had. His hands shook as he loaded the single rocket into the launcher, not from fear, but from the bitter cold that had seeped into his bones over the past 3 days. The Panzer was now less than 40 yards away, close enough that he could hear the German crew talking inside the turret, close enough to see the frost forming on the barrel of its main gun, close enough to know that if he missed this shot, he wouldn't get another one. Curry adjusted the crude iron sights on the bazooka, trying to steady his breathing despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had fired this weapon exactly twice in training, both times at stationary targets on a sunny day in Georgia. This was different. This was a moving target in poor visibility with the lives of 5 men hanging in the balance. The tank commander's hatch popped open. A German officer emerged, scanning the ruins with binoculars. For a moment, his gaze swept right over Curry's position without seeing him. The camouflage of rubble and shadow was working, but it wouldn't last long. Curry waited. The Panzer began to turn, exposing its flank as it navigated around a shell crater in the road. This was his window. Maybe 3 seconds before the tank would straighten out and present only its heavily armored front. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket roared from the launcher with a flash of fire and smoke that lit up the entire factory ruins. It streaked across the 40 yards of open ground, trailing sparks and leaving a white contrail in the frigid air. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack followed by the whoosh of the rocket motor that seemed to go on forever. Then impact. The rocket slammed into the Panzer's side armor just below the turret ring with a thunderous explosion. Orange flame erupted from the entry point. The massive tank lurched sideways, its treads grinding as against stone. The crew inside fought for control. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. German voices screamed commands and warnings that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Curry didn't wait to admire his handiwork. He dropped the empty bazooka and sprinted back toward the factory, zigzagging through debris as machine gun fire erupted behind him. Bullets cracked through the air around his head, striking sparks off metal beams and sending chips of concrete flying. One round passed so close to his helmet that he felt the wind of its passage. Inside the factory, he grabbed a Browning automatic rifle that had belonged to one of the wounded men and took position at a blown-out window. The German infantry was scattering for cover, but some were trying to flank around the burning tank. Curry opened fire, the bar chattering in short, controlled bursts. He watched 2 German soldiers fall before the others dove behind whatever cover they could find. But this was just the beginning. Through the smoke and confusion, Curry could see more shapes moving in the mist. Another tank was positioning itself further back, its crew now fully aware that someone was shooting at them from the factory. A second Panzer rolled into view, this one approaching more cautiously, its machine guns already firing, suppressing bursts into the building. The Germans were regrouping faster than he had hoped. Without proper intelligence on American strength, they probably thought they were facing a full anti-tank team, maybe even a reinforced position. That misconception was the only thing keeping them from rushing the factory immediately. Curry crawled through a hole in the wall and made his way to where he had spotted another rocket earlier. This one in the pack of a fallen American soldier near the rear of the building. His fingers were so numb from cold that he could barely work the straps, but he managed to extract the projectile and drag it back to his firing position. The second Panzer was advancing more slowly now, its turret traversing back and forth as the crew searched for targets. But they were still following the same route, still forced to navigate around the burning hulk of the first tank, still vulnerable to a well-placed shot from the side. Curry loaded the rocket into the bazooka and settled in behind a different pile of rubble, knowing that the Germans would be watching his previous position. The tank crept forward, its commander standing in the open hatch with binoculars, directing the advance. 30 yards, 25, 20. The Panzer began its turn around the burning wreckage. Once again, that critical moment when heavy frontal armor gave way to thinner side plating. Curry held his breath, led the target slightly to account for its movement, and fired. The second rocket struck home with the same devastating effect. Another explosion, another pillar of smoke and flame. The tank shuddered to a halt, its turret slewing wildly as the crew tried to locate their attacker. Then the ammunition inside began to cook off, sending secondary explosions rippling through the vehicle's hull. Now the Germans were truly confused. Radio chatter crackled across their frequencies as officers tried to piece together what they were facing. 2 tanks destroyed by what appeared to be a coordinated anti-tank ambush. But there had been no muzzle flashes from, no supporting multiple positions fire from other weapons. Just 2 precise shots from somewhere in the ruins. The infantry began to pull back, seeking cover in the tree line while their commanders reassessed the situation. For a moment, the road fell quiet except for the crackling of burning vehicles and the hiss of steam where hot metal met snow. But Curry knew this respite wouldn't last long. He could see more movement in the forest beyond, more vehicles positioning themselves for another assault. The Germans weren't retreating. They were just changing tactics. He crawled back to check on the wounded men, giving them water from his canteen and adjusting their makeshift bandages. One had a compound fracture in his leg that was slowly bleeding through the field dressing. Another was unconscious from a head wound but still breathing steadily. They were alive, but they needed medical attention that wasn't coming anytime soon. Above them, the sound of engines grew louder. Not tanks this time, but the higher-pitched whine of half-tracks and armored cars. The Germans were bringing up infantry support, probably planning to storm the factory with overwhelming numbers while their remaining armor provided covering fire. Curry looked around the ruined building, taking inventory of his remaining weapons and ammunition. No more bazooka rounds. His BAR had maybe 2 magazines left. There was a .30 caliber machine gun mounted on a damaged Jeep outside, but reaching it would mean crossing open ground under direct observation. It was then that he made perhaps the most dangerous decision of that entire morning. Instead of staying in the relative safety of the factory, instead of trying to hold his position until he was overrun, Francis Curry decided to go on the attack. The half-track was a death trap waiting to happen. Positioned near the bridge, the American vehicle had taken a direct hit hours earlier, its side armor crumpled like paper, windows blown out, interior gutted by fire. But mounted on top, somehow still intact, was a Browning .50 caliber machine gun, heavy enough to punch through light armor, devastating against infantry, and completely exposed to enemy fire. To reach it, Curry would have to sprint across 30 yards of open ground in full view of German positions. Every sniper, every machine gunner, every tank commander would have a clear shot at him. The smart play was to stay put, conserve ammunition, hope for reinforcements. But smart plays don't win impossible battles. Curry checked the bar one last time, slung it across his back, and whispered a prayer his grandmother had taught him years ago in that small church back in Hurleyville. Then he ran straight into hell. The moment his boots hit the frozen ground outside the factory, the world exploded around him. Rifle fire cracked from 3 different directions. Machine gun rounds chewed up the earth at his feet, sending geysers of ice and dirt skyward. A mortar shell landed 15 yards to his left, the concussion nearly knocking him sideways. But he kept running, weaving between shell craters and debris, using every piece of cover he could find. Halfway to the half-track, something hot punched through the sleeve of his jacket, missing his arm by inches. Another round ricocheted off his a sharp ping that helmet with left his ears ringing. But the vehicle was getting closer. 20 yards, 15, 10. He dove the last few feet, sliding across the icy ground and slamming into the half-track's twisted chassis. The metal was searingly cold against his hands as he hauled himself up onto the roof. The .50 caliber was there, ammunition belt still partially loaded, but covered in frost and debris. His fingers worked frantically to clear the action while bullets sparked off the armor plating around him. The gun was jammed. Ice had formed in the receiver during the long cold night, and the belt mechanism was frozen solid. Curry could hear German voices getting closer, officers shouting orders, boots crunching through snow. In maybe 30 seconds, they would be close enough to rush his position. He yanked off his gloves and breathed on the metal parts, trying to warm them enough to function. His skin stuck to the frozen steel, tearing when he pulled away, but the mechanism began to move. He worked the charging handle twice, 3 times, feeling something give way inside the weapon. Then the Browning roared to life. The .50 caliber was a monster. Each round was as long as a man's finger, traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, capable of punching through an inch of solid steel. When Curry squeezed the trigger, the weapon bucked against its mount like a living thing, spitting fire and thunder across the battlefield. German soldiers who had been advancing in the open suddenly found themselves caught in a storm of heavy machine gun fire. The rounds tore through trees, shredded wooden crates, turned stone walls into clouds of dust and fragments. Men dove for cover, crawled behind anything they could find, some not fast enough to escape the devastating fire. But the gun made Curry a target for every weapon on the battlefield. A German sniper's bullet cracked past his head so close, he felt the heat. Mortar rounds began falling around the half-track, each explosion walking closer to his position. The twisted metal beneath him rang like a bell with each impact, transferring the shock waves through his bones. He swiveled the gun toward a group of infantry trying to flank through the trees. The heavy rounds chewed through pine trunks like they were matchsticks, sending entire trees toppling. A German machine gun position that had been giving him trouble simply vanished in a cloud of splinters and smoke. For 20 minutes, Curry dominated the battlefield from that exposed position. Every time the Germans tried to advance, the .50 caliber drove them back. Every time they attempted to coordinate an assault, he disrupted their formations with precise bursts of fire. The psychological effect was enormous. To the Germans, it seemed like they were facing a full defensive position, not one teenager with a borrowed weapon. But the gun was overheating. Steam rose from the barrel in the cold air. The metal was glowing dull red despite the freezing temperature. The ammunition belt was running low, and Curry could feel the weapon starting to malfunction. Rounds were firing slower, the mechanism struggling against the heat and wear. Then it jammed completely. Curry worked frantically to clear the stoppage, but the barrel was too hot to touch and the action was seized solid. Around him, the Germans had noticed the sudden silence. Voices called out in the distance. Engines revved. They were preparing for another push. He abandoned the .50 caliber and dropped back to ground level, taking cover behind the half-track's bulk. Through gaps in the armor, he could see movement in the tree line. A third Panzer was positioning itself for a direct assault on the factory. This one had learned from the fate of its predecessors. Instead of approaching slowly, it was going to charge straight across the open ground, using speed and armor to overwhelm any opposition. Curry had no anti-tank weapons left. No rockets, no grenades, nothing that could penetrate the thick frontal armor of a Panzer. All he had was his bar, a few magazines of rifle ammunition, and the desperate hope that he could somehow find another way to stop 30 tons of German steel. The tank's engine roared as it accelerated across the frozen field. Its tracks threw up clouds of snow and dirt. The main gun was already traversing toward the factory where the wounded Americans lay helpless. In maybe 60 seconds, it would be close enough to fire high-explosive shells directly into the building. That's when Curry remembered the fuel truck. Earlier in the battle, a German supply vehicle had been hit by American artillery and abandoned near the tree line. It was loaded with diesel fuel for the advancing armor, hundreds of gallons in steel drums stacked in the cargo bed. The truck itself was damaged, but the fuel was still there, still volatile, still dangerous, if he could reach it. If he could find a way to ignite it at the right moment. If he could time it perfectly with the Panzer's approach. It was a plan built on desperation and luck, with about a dozen ways it could go wrong. But it was the only chance he had. Curry sprinted from the half-track toward the tree line, using smoke and debris for cover. The Panzer was closing fast, its commander standing in the open hatch, directing the assault. German infantry was advancing on both flanks, trying to coordinate their attack with the armor. The fuel truck sat tilted against a shattered pine tree, its windshield spider webbed with cracks, bullet holes stitched across its cab. Curry could smell diesel fuel in the air, see dark stains in the snow where drums had been punctured by shrapnel. The cargo bed was a maze of twisted metal and leaking containers. He climbed into the truck bed, his boots slipping on the icy metal. The fuel drums were heavy, awkward, some of them already cracked and seeping, but several were still intact, still full, still potentially devastating if used correctly. The Panzer was maybe 200 yards away now, close enough that he could hear the whine of its transmission, see the muzzle flash as its machine guns opened fire on the factory, close enough to seed on its the iron crosses paint turret sides. Curry grabbed one of the fuel drums, a 50-gallon container that weighed more than he did, and wrestled it toward the edge of the truck bed. His plan was insane, desperate, and probably suicidal, but it was all he had left. He was going to turn himself into a human torpedo, rolling a drum of diesel fuel directly into the path of an advancing Panzer tank, then somehow igniting it at the moment of impact. The explosion might disable the tank, or it might just get him killed without accomplishing anything. But those 5 wounded men were that still in factory. The German advance was still threatening to break through the American lines, and Francis Sherman Curry, 19 years old and 10,000 miles from home, had made a promise to himself that morning that he was going to hold that bridge no matter what it cost. The Panzer was accelerating now, committed to its final assault. Curry could see the determination in the tank commander's posture, the way the vehicle's gun was already lined up on target. In another minute, maybe less, high explosive shells would be tearing through the factory walls, unless one farm boy from upstate New York could find a way to stop them. He heaved the fuel drum over the side of the truck and began rolling it across the frozen ground toward the oncoming tank. The metal container left a dark trail in the snow, diesel fuel sloshing inside with each revolution. Behind him, German infantry had spotted his movement and were shouting warnings to their armor. The Panzer's machine gun swiveled toward him, muzzle flashes strobing in the gray morning light. Bullets cracked through the air around him, some striking the fuel drum with sharp metallic pings. One round passed so close to his head that he felt his hair move in the wind of its passage. But he kept pushing the drum forward, using his body as a shield, knowing that the Germans couldn't risk hitting their own fuel with high-explosive rounds. The tank was close now, maybe 50 yards, close enough that he could see the individual track links, hear the radio chatter from inside the turret. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. Either his desperate plan would work, or Francis Curry would die trying. But either way, he wasn't backing down. The fuel drum rolled across the frozen ground like a metal boulder, leaving a dark smear of diesel in the snow. Curry's lungs burned with each breath of the bitter air, but he kept pushing, kept driving the heavy container toward its target. The Panzer was closing fast, its treads chewing up the earth, engine roaring like some mechanical beast hungry for destruction. At 30 yards, Curry dove behind a fallen tree trunk and pulled the pin on his last grenade. This was the moment everything depended on. Too early and the explosion would miss. Too late and the tank would crush him before he could act. He had maybe 3 seconds to get this right. The Panzer's front armor filled his vision. He could see the driver's vision port, the machine gun mount, even scratches in the paint from previous battles. The tank commander was still standing in his hatch, shouting orders, completely focused on the factory ahead. Curry hurled the grenade with everything he had left. It arced through the air, a small dark object against the gray sky, and landed directly beside the fuel drum just as the Panzer's right tread was about to crush it. The explosion was beyond anything he had imagined. The diesel fuel ignited in a massive fireball that rose 50 feet into the air, a pillar of orange flame and black smoke that could be seen for miles. The concussion knocked Curry backwards into the snow, his ears ringing, his vision blurred by the flash. When his sight cleared, the Panzer had vanished. In its place was a twisted mass of burning metal, completely engulfed in flames. The turret had been blown clean off and lay upside down 20 yards away. Smoke poured from every opening in the hull. No one could have survived inside. The German infantry froze. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Some men began falling back toward the tree line while others pressed forward, unsure what to do without their armor support. The entire assault was collapsing into chaos. But Curry wasn't finished. He crawled toward another abandoned American position where he'd spotted a damaged but functional .30 caliber machine gun. His hands were burned from the explosion, his uniform singed and torn, but adrenaline kept him moving. The weapon was mounted on a tripod behind a low stone wall, its barrel pointed toward the bridge. German soldiers were scattered across the battlefield now, some taking cover, others trying to regroup. Their commanders had lost control of the situation. What had started as a coordinated armored assault had devolved into confused squads of infantry fighting without clear objectives. Curry opened fire with the machine gun, short controlled bursts that cut down anyone who tried to advance on the factory. He could see German officers waving their arms, trying to rally their men. But the psychological impact of losing 3 tanks had shattered their confidence. These weren't green recruits. These were veterans who understood that something had gone terribly wrong with their attack. The sound of engines reached his ears, but these weren't German engines. These were the higher-pitched whines of American jeeps and half-tracks approaching from the rear. Reinforcements were finally arriving, drawn by the smoke and explosions that had been visible across half the sector. A squad of American infantry came running across the field, their sergeant shouting orders as they spread out and began engaging the scattered German forces. Behind them, an American tank destroyer rolled into position, its long gun already tracking targets in the tree line. The tide had turned. What had begun as a German breakthrough attempt was now a retreat. Enemy soldiers were melting back into the forest, carrying their wounded, abandoning equipment. The bridge remained in American hands. Curry slumped behind the machine gun, his strength finally giving out. His hands shook as he tried to reload, but there was no need. The Germans were gone. The road was clear. The 5 wounded men in the factory were safe. For 3 hours, one 19-year-old farm boy from upstate New York had held off an entire German armored column with nothing but borrowed weapons and unshakable resolve. Francis Curry didn't just save 5 wounded soldiers that day. He helped turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge itself. His suicidal angle became the foundation for a legend that proved sometimes the most impossible positions are the ones that change history forever.